Rupert, thanks for joining us today. So my first question to you is, what is the statement that Pelosi or perhaps even the U.S. intended to make with this trip?
Well, it's very nice to be back on the show. Thank you for including me. I think what we're seeing here with Mrs. Pelosi's trip to Taiwan is twofold. One, it's the consistent nature of U.S. policy and its commitment to Taiwan. That includes high-level U.S. government officials visiting the island to communicate with the island's leadership about shared interests across the board, economic, political, cultural, and so on. That is something the United States has done since 1979 in the switch in recognition. I think the second thing that's important to bear in mind here is just how disruptive PRC behavior is in the Taiwan Strait and the extent to which Beijing, not Taipei and Washington, continues to be the significant disruptor of peace and security in the Taiwan Strait and the one disrupting the status quo. What is transpiring here is can and should be laid at the feet of Beijing and Mr. Xi, not at the feet of Mr. Biden and President Tsai.
You know, on that point, a day before the trip, Beijing's foreign ministry said that the Chinese military will not stand idly by, right, if Pelosi goes to Taiwan. Now, personally, I thought this was a threat of military action. Do they just mean they were going to do drills?
Well, I think they keep it intentionally ambiguous. The military threats, you are correct. It was a military threat. We're used to military threats from China. We shouldn't be cavalier about it. The Chinese have expended significant resources since the 95-96 missile crisis to build up their military capabilities. So we shouldn't be cavalier about their ability to use those. But we also need to put into context their approach to pressuring and coercing Taiwan.
How would this impact U.S.-China tensions, if it would?
Well, I think that's the big question, isn't it? What are the longer-term implications over Mrs. Pelosi going that has characterized the last several weeks and has disrupted capital markets? And, we've seen share prices go down for individual companies, for markets generally over this. It's got way out of hand. And the overreaction on this trip has really been striking. But importantly, it fits with one of China's stated goals, which is to coerce Taiwan. How do they go about that? Well, economic coercion is important. The more economically successful Taiwan is, separate of China's economic engine, the more vitality and independence with a small I Taiwan has, the more ability it has for self-determination. The more that China can constrict that by pressuring the island and pressuring global markets and global businesses not to engage the island, the more they can make the case or press Taiwan to engage China economically. And that, of course, equips China then to leverage that economic dependency into political concessions. So that I think is the longer term concern. In the coming years, how is this political and military intimidation that Chinese are directing at Taiwan going to impact how global business sees Taiwan in the future? And as a consequence, what kind of pressure can the PRC apply if it in fact weakens Taiwan economically?
Now, on that point of business, will this visit boost the chance of the U.S.-Taiwan trade deal? For example, the chips industry, the relationship there?
Well, I certainly think that's at the core. The semiconductor relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan, Japan, of course, is enormously important to so many industries. The economic ramifications of cutting Taiwan off from the global supply chain are manifestly more serious for the global economy than they are with the war going on in Ukraine. The bilateral trade agreement between Taiwan and the United States is an absolute must. If there's one country, if there's one entity that could potentially be seen to do a trade agreement with, it is 100% Taiwan, and it would have bipartisan support. So I'm hoping that will be given a fresh look in the coming months.
I see. Just one last question, Rupert. Pelosi visited Taiwan despite all the threats from China. So going forward, do you think China should get the message that U.S. will not back down in the face of threats?
I think there are two sides to this coin. The one side is, yes, Mrs. Pelosi went, and that signaled to China that we will continue to send senior officials to Taiwan. Conversely, on the other side of the coin, China, or certainly some in China, have a clear understanding of how our government works, the division of power between congressional and executive branch, and how successfully these past 2 weeks they've managed to shape this narrative. And that much of the coverage and much of the statements out of governments, think tanks, academics, even businesses characterizes PRC priorities, not US and Taiwan priorities. I think from that standpoint, we have real cause for concern.
Right. Thank you for your insight, Rupert Hammett-Chambers, President of U.S.-Taiwan Business Council. Thank you very much for coming on.
It's always my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.